A war that was never supposed to last more than 6 weeks, a military operation described as precise and strategic, and a president who promised swift, decisive action. But 1 month in, something has gone deeply, catastrophically wrong, and the options left on the table are growing more dangerous by the day. This is the story of how a conflict spiraled far beyond its original boundaries, why hundreds of elite special forces soldiers are now being quietly moved into position across the Middle East, and what a mission to extract nearly 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium from inside a nation of 90 million people would actually look like and cost. Several hundred U.S. Special Operations Forces have recently arrived in the Middle East. Among them, Army Rangers and Navy SEALs, two of the most elite units in the American military. They're joining thousands of Marines and Army paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the most storied rapid deployment forces in U.S. history. The USS Tripoli arrived in the region on Friday. Tens of thousands of American troops are now positioned around Iran. The stated purpose is to give decision-makers additional options. But here's what that phrase actually means. Planning is already underway for possible ground invasions, and one of the most discussed proposals involves sending these special forces directly into Iran, not to fight in a conventional sense, but to physically locate, secure, and extract nearly 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium from at least 2 different sites inside the country. Let that land for a moment. According to reporting from both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, this operation is not a theoretical contingency. It is being actively considered. And the experts who have analyzed what such a mission would require are not optimistic. Richard Nephew, a senior research scholar at Columbia University and a former nuclear negotiator with Iran, has outlined what the extraction would involve. The highly enriched uranium is believed to be stored in 40 to 50 specialized cylinders, containers roughly resembling scuba tanks. Those cylinders can't simply be loaded into a helicopter and flown out. Each would need to be placed into heavy shielded transportation casks to prevent radiation exposure. That equipment alone would fill several large trucks. Teams would fly in likely under live fire from Iranian surface-to-air missile systems and drone swarms. Once on the ground, combat troops would need to secure a perimeter around the site while engineers with excavating equipment cleared debris and checked for mines and booby traps. Unless a usable airfield was nearby, a temporary one would need to be constructed from scratch, in the middle of an active war zone. The whole operation, experts estimate, would take days, possibly a week or longer, and when it was over, Iran would almost certainly retaliate, massively. But the military buildup is only one part of what's unfolding, because in the middle of all this, while oil prices are surging past $100 a barrel on global markets, while U.S. military bases across the region are taking fire, and while allies are quietly expressing alarm, the president gave an interview to the Financial Times. And what he said revealed something about the strategic vision driving this conflict that no military briefing ever could. "My favorite thing," he said, "is to take their oil. That's my favorite thing, to take all of the oil of Iran." He also said he was considering seizing Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export hub, and drew a direct comparison to Venezuela, suggesting American forces could control Iranian oil production indefinitely, the same way U.S. influence has operated in Venezuelan energy infrastructure. He said Iran had no real defenses left. He said it would be easy. He said an occupation might be necessary, but that he had the appetite for it. He said Americans would support it. What no one in that interview asked was this: if the war was already won, why were elite paratroopers still flooding into the region? On the diplomatic front, the picture being presented publicly bears almost no resemblance to what's actually being said behind closed doors. The president has claimed that Iran has agreed to most of the 15 conditions outlined in a formal proposal. He described the new Iranian leadership as very reasonable people and said regime change had, in effect, already occurred. He pointed to one specific gesture as proof of Iranian goodwill: 20 Pakistani-flagged vessels being allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz. But here is where the story diverges sharply from the version being told. Those vessels were not escorted by the United States Navy. They were escorted by the Iranian Navy. Iran granted permission for Pakistan, an ally, to move ships through a waterway that Iran controls. The United States had nothing to do with it. Iranian leadership was quick to point out the irony. Before this conflict began, Iran did not control the Strait of Hormuz in any meaningful toll-collecting capacity. Now, as a direct result of the war, Iran is effectively positioned to impose transit fees on global shipping. The nation's parliament speaker openly mocked the outcome, calling it a stunning geopolitical gift, delivered by the very power that launched the war against them. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio, speaking at the G7 meeting in France, acknowledged to allied nations that the likely outcome is a world that must now pay a toll to Iran to use the strait. That statement alone sent shockwaves through global energy markets. Iran's actual negotiating position couldn't be further from the surrender narrative being presented. Iranian leadership has publicly laid out a set of preconditions just to begin talks, not to conclude them, but to begin them. Those conditions include full financial reparations from the United States, permanent security guarantees against future American or Israeli strikes, protection of allied groups across the region, the right to continue uranium enrichment, retention of all ballistic missile capabilities, the closure of U.S. military bases throughout the Middle East, and a formal public apology. Until those conditions are met, Iran has stated clearly, there is nothing to discuss. On the ground, the conflict has already expanded well beyond Iranian borders. Iranian-backed militia groups operating with what appears to be green light from the Iraqi government have been targeting U.S.-linked military infrastructure inside Iraq. A military transport aircraft at Baghdad International Airport was struck using a coordinated drone and rocket swarm attack, sustaining visible and significant damage. Attacks have also struck Kuwait, specifically a power and water desalination facility. Bahrain has been hit repeatedly. The UAE has seen strikes across multiple cities including Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Israel continues to face missile fire from both Iranian forces and Houthi groups operating out of Yemen. Iran's military has explicitly warned that future strikes will target residential areas connected to U.S. and Israeli military commanders, a direct response, they say, to American and Israeli strikes on Iranian civilian neighborhoods, universities, and infrastructure. Confirmed civilian casualties inside Iran now number in the hundreds, with some estimates climbing far higher. Among the most documented incidents, an airstrike on a gymnasium that killed dozens of civilians, and a strike near the city of Manab that killed 165 children. Back in Washington, the economic picture is deteriorating in ways that were entirely predictable. Brent crude has climbed past $114 a barrel. WTI crude crossed the $100 threshold and held. Futures markets are signaling deep instability. Analysts and government officials have begun modeling scenarios in which oil reaches $200 a barrel, a level with no historical precedent and consequences that economists describe in terms not of recession, but of potential economic collapse. The total cost of the war, in terms of weapons expenditure, military deployment, and economic disruption, has already reached the hundreds of billions of dollars range. The national debt crossed $39 trillion weeks ago, and still, the bills keep climbing. Here's the question that hangs over everything. How does a conflict that was framed as swift and surgical, measured in weeks, not months, arrive at a point where special forces are planning week-long uranium extraction missions inside enemy territory, where oil is over $100 a barrel, where over 50,000 American troops are deployed, and where the adversary is not surrendering, but expanding the battlefield? The official version says the war is going well, that regime change has been achieved, that deals are imminent, that Iran is practically begging for peace. The ground version, the one reflected in the movement of troops, the surge in oil prices, the spread of attacks across 6 countries, and the silence from Iranian negotiators, tells a very different story. 1 month in, months more expected to follow, the end game nowhere in sight. And the most dangerous part of this story may not be what has already happened, but what comes next.